Few figures in history have captured the imagination quite like Napoleon Bonaparte. A man who rose from obscure origins on a Mediterranean island to become Emperor of France and Master of Europe. Our story begins not in France, but on the island of Corsica, in the small town of Ajaccio. On August 15th, 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte was born into a family of minor Italian nobility. The timing of his birth was significant. Corsica had been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France just a year earlier in 1768. Napoleon was born French by mere months, though he would grow up speaking Corsican and Italian before mastering French. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer who had initially supported Corsican independence under the patriot leader Pasquale Paoli. But after the French conquest, Carlo pragmatically shifted his allegiance to the new rulers, a political flexibility his son would later exhibit. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a strong-willed woman who would live to see her son become emperor and just as dramatically fall from power. Napoleon was the second surviving child in what would become a family of 8 children. Life in Corsica was modest, even for a family that could claim noble status. The island was rugged, poor, and fiercely proud. Young Napoleon absorbed the warrior culture around him, the stories of Corsican resistance, and developed an early sense that he was destined for something greater than his circumstances suggested. In 1778, when Napoleon was 9 years old, his father secured scholarships for him and his older brother Joseph to attend school in mainland France. This was Napoleon's first great break, though it came with a price. He left behind his island home and was thrust into an alien world where he was mocked for his accent, his poverty, and his Corsican origins. At the religious school in Autun, and later at the military academy at Brienne-le-Château, young Napoleon was an outsider, often bullied by wealthier French boys. But adversity forged him. He threw himself into his studies, particularly mathematics and history. He devoured books about great military commanders, especially Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Hannibal. He spent hours alone, developing the intense inner life and burning ambition that would define him. In the snow-covered courtyards of Brienne, the small Corsican boy dreamed of glory. Napoleon excelled in mathematics and military subjects, and in 1784, at age 15, he was selected to attend the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. This was another crucial step. In just 1 year, he completed a program that typically took 3, graduating as a second lieutenant in the artillery in September 1785. At 16, Napoleon Bonaparte was an officer in the French Royal Army, specializing in artillery, which would prove decisive in his future battles. The young Lieutenant Bonaparte was posted to various garrison towns in France, a period of relative obscurity. He returned frequently to Corsica, where his heart still lay. He even wrote a romantic history of his island, homeland, and flirted with Corsican nationalism. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Napoleon was 20 years old, and like many young officers, he initially welcomed the revolutionary changes. The revolution that began with the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, would transform not just France, but Napoleon's entire trajectory. The old order was being swept away. The monarchy, the nobility, the church, all the structures that had defined France for centuries were being challenged and overturned. For an ambitious young officer from the provinces, this was opportunity incarnate. Napoleon became an enthusiastic supporter of the revolution. He joined the Jacobin Club in Valence and participated in local revolutionary politics. But his relationship with his beloved Corsica became complicated. When Pasquale Paoli returned from exile and eventually broke with revolutionary France, the Bonaparte family, who supported the French Republic, had to flee Corsica in 1793. Napoleon would never live in his homeland again. From this point forward, he was fully French. even changing the spelling of his name from the Italian Bonaparte to the French Bonaparte. The year 1793 was decisive. France was at war with most of Europe. The king had been executed in January, and the revolution was entering its most radical phase. Napoleon was still just a captain, but his moment was coming. In September 1793, he was sent to Toulon, a vital Mediterranean port that had been seized by royalist rebels and was being held by British and Spanish forces. The siege of Toulon was Napoleon's first real opportunity to shine. The young artillery officer, still only 24, devised a bold plan. He proposed placing artillery batteries on strategic heights that would force the British fleet to evacuate the harbour. His plan was adopted, and despite being wounded in the thigh during the fighting, Napoleon's strategy worked brilliantly. The French recaptured Toulon in December 1793. Augustin Robespierre, brother of the revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, was present at Toulon and was impressed by the young officer's abilities. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at age 24. His star was rising rapidly, but the revolution was a dangerous time to be noticed. When Robespierre fell from power and was guillotined in July 1794, Napoleon was briefly arrested due to his association with the Robespierre family. He was released after 2 weeks, but his career stalled. He spent a frustrating period in Paris, poor and uncertain of his future. He even considered taking a military position with the Ottoman Empire, but fate intervened once more. On October 5, 1795, the royalist rebels attempted to seize power in Paris. The government turned to Paul Barras, a director of the new regime, who remembered the capable young artillery officer from Toulon. Napoleon was given command of the troops defending the government. What happened next became known as 13 Vendémiaire in the revolutionary calendar. Napoleon positioned his artillery, a whiff of grape shot, as he later called it, and fired on the advancing royalist columns on the steps of the Church of St. Roch. The rebellion was crushed in a matter of hours. Napoleon had saved the government. Within days, he was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior and promoted to Major General. At 26, he was suddenly a powerful figure in Paris. Success in Paris brought Napoleon more than military advancement. It brought him Josephine. Through Barras, Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior with 2 children. She moved in elite Parisian circles and was everything Napoleon was not. Sophisticated, socially adept, aristocratic by marriage. Napoleon fell madly, obsessively in love. Josephine was more calculating about the relationship, but she saw the advantage in marrying the rising general. They married on March 9, 1796, in a brief civil ceremony. Napoleon lied about his age, making himself older, while Josephine lied about hers, making herself younger. 2 days later, Napoleon left Paris to take command of the army of Italy. He would not see his new wife for months, though he wrote her passionate, desperate letters that she rarely answered. The Italian campaign of 1796 and 1797 was where Napoleon truly became Napoleon. He took command of an army that was underfed, underpaid, and demoralized. Within weeks, he had transformed it. He issued a proclamation promising his soldiers the rich plunder of Italy if they would follow him. Then he proceeded to win victory after victory against the Austrians and their allies. The secret to Napoleon's success was his revolutionary approach to warfare. While other generals followed the rigid, methodical strategies of 18th century warfare, Napoleon moved with lightning speed. He concentrated his forces at decisive points, struck hard, then moved before the enemy could react. He understood that mobility and morale were as important as numbers. He personally visited his troops, learned their names, promoted on merit rather than birth, and shared their hardships. His soldiers began to worship him. At the Battle of Lodi in May 1796, Napoleon personally led a charge across a bridge under heavy fire. His soldiers saw him risk his life alongside them and began calling him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a nickname he cherished. In a series of brilliant victories at Arcole and Rivoli, Napoleon defeated larger Austrian armies. By April 1797, he had forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio, ending the War of the First Coalition. France gained control of Belgium and the Rhineland, while Napoleon created several French satellite republics in Italy. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1797 as a conquering hero. At 28, he was the most celebrated man in France. The Directory, France's ruling executive, was both grateful and nervous. Napoleon was clearly ambitious, clearly popular with the army, and clearly dangerous to the civilian government. They needed to send him somewhere far away. Egypt was the answer. Napoleon proposed an expedition to Egypt that would threaten British trade routes to India. It was a grand strategic vision wrapped in Enlightenment romanticism about exploring the ancient land of the pharaohs. The Directory approved, happy to have the dangerous young general occupied far from Paris. The Egyptian campaign began in May 1798 with a fleet of 400 ships and 54,000 men. Napoleon took with him not just soldiers, but a commission of 167 scientists, engineers, and scholars. He captured Malta along the way and landed in Egypt in July. He defeated the Mamluk rulers of Egypt at the Battle of the Pyramids, supposedly telling his troops, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Napoleon occupied Cairo and began reorganizing Egyptian society along French lines. The scholars began their work, which would result in the monumental Description de l'Égypte and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which would eventually unlock the secret of hieroglyphics. But military disaster was looming. In August 1798, Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and destroyed it in the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon's army was stranded in Egypt, cut off from France. Nevertheless, Napoleon marched into Syria in early 1799, besieging the city of Acre. The siege failed, and Napoleon had to retreat back to Egypt. The plague broke out among his troops. The dream of a French empire in the east was dying. Then Napoleon received news from France. The Directory was failing. France was losing the war against the Second Coalition. Political chaos reigned. Napoleon made a momentous decision. In August 1799, leaving his army behind under the command of General Kleber, Napoleon and a few close associates slipped through the British naval blockade and returned to France. He abandoned his army to pursue power at home. Napoleon arrived back in France in October 1799 to find the country in crisis. Military defeats abroad, bankruptcy at home, and political paralysis had made the Directory deeply unpopular. Various factions were plotting to overthrow it. Napoleon was approached by Abbé Sieyès and others who wanted to stage a coup and needed a general with a loyal army to back them up. On November 9, 1799, Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, the conspirators made their move. The legislature was moved to St. Cloud, supposedly for safety. Napoleon was appointed to command the troops in Paris. The plot was to pressure the legislature to dissolve the Directory and create a new government with Napoleon, Sieyès, and Roger Ducos as temporary consuls. But the coup nearly failed. When Napoleon addressed the Council of 500, he was met with hostility. Deputies shouted, "Outlaw him!" recalling that this was how Robespierre had been brought down. Napoleon, usually so composed under fire, panicked and had to be rescued by his soldiers. His brother Lucien, president of the council, saved the day by claiming that deputies were threatening Napoleon with daggers. Troops cleared the chamber, and by the next morning, a rump session had approved the new government. France had a new constitution and a new form of government, the consulate. There were 3 consuls, but Napoleon as first consul held the real power. He was 30 years old. Within weeks, he had consolidated his position. CS was sidelined. Napoleon appointed his own men to key positions. A new constitution was drafted that gave the first consul executive power while maintaining the facade of republican government. In a plebiscite, over 3 million voted in favour, with fewer than 2,000 against. Though these numbers were certainly manipulated. Napoleon set about transforming France. He was a whirlwind of activity, working 18-hour days, dictating to multiple secretaries, involving himself in every detail of government. His genius was not just military, but administrative. He created the Bank of France to stabilize the currency. He reformed the tax system to fund the government. He made peace with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, ending the religious strife that had torn France apart, though he kept the Church subordinate to the state. Most importantly, Napoleon initiated the creation of the Civil Code, later known as the Napoleonic Code, promulgated in 1804. This was his most lasting achievement, a rational, clear codification of French law that abolished feudalism, established equality before the law, protected property rights, and secularized society. The code would be adopted, with modifications, throughout much of Europe and Latin America. Even today, the legal systems of dozens of countries are based on Napoleonic principles. Militarily, Napoleon moved to secure France's position. In the spring of the year 1800, he personally led an army across the Alps into Italy in a daring campaign. At the Battle of Marengo on June 14th, Napoleon achieved a dramatic victory over the Austrians that cemented his military legend, though in truth, he had nearly lost the battle before his subordinates saved the day. But Napoleon controlled the narrative. Marengo became a symbol of his genius, and he commissioned multiple paintings of his Alps crossing, showing him on a rearing stallion, though he had actually crossed on a mule. By 1802, Napoleon had made peace with Britain through the Treaty of Amiens. For the first time in a decade, France was at peace with all of Europe. Napoleon's popularity was at its height. A new plebiscite made him consul for life, with the power to name his successor. The Republic was becoming a monarchy in all but name. In 1804, a conspiracy to assassinate Napoleon, backed by Britain and involving royalist agents, was uncovered. Napoleon's response was severe. He ordered the kidnapping and execution of the Duc d'Enghien, a Bourbon prince living in Baden, on flimsy evidence of involvement. The execution shocked Europe and showed Napoleon's ruthlessness, but it also signaled that he would show no mercy to the old royal families. The conspiracy convinced Napoleon that hereditary rule was necessary for stability. If he could be assassinated, France would fall back into chaos. He needed to found a dynasty. In May 1804, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Emperor of the French. Another plebiscite approved the change by over 3 million votes. The boy from Corsica had become emperor. The coronation of Napoleon as emperor took place on December 2nd, year 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral. Pope Pius VII travelled from Rome to consecrate the new emperor, but in a carefully staged moment, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and crowned himself, then crowned Josephine as empress. The symbolism was clear. Napoleon's authority came from himself, from his own merit and achievements, not from God or ancient bloodlines. Napoleon created a new imperial nobility, making his brothers kings and his generals princes and dukes. The revolutionary general had created a court that rivaled the old Bourbon monarchy in splendor. The Tuileries Palace glittered with balls and ceremonies, but unlike the old aristocracy, Napoleon's nobles had earned their positions through service to France and to him. It was a meritocracy, even if an authoritarian one. But peace did not last. Britain refused to accept French dominance of the continent, and by year 1805, Napoleon faced the Third Coalition. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden united against France. Napoleon's planned invasion of Britain was impossible, while the Royal Navy ruled the seas. When the French and Spanish fleets were destroyed by Nelson at Trafalgar on October 21st, year 1805, any hope of invading Britain died with them. Nelson died in the battle, but Britain's naval supremacy was assured. Napoleon turned his armies eastward. In August 1805, he broke up his invasion camps on the English Channel and marched his Grande Armée east with breathtaking speed. The Austrians and Russians never expected him to move so fast. On October 20th, at Ulm, Napoleon surrounded an entire Austrian army under General Mack and forced it to surrender without a major battle. It was a strategic masterpiece. Napoleon entered Vienna in November. Then came Austerlitz. On December 2nd, year 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon faced the combined Austrian and Russian armies commanded by Tsar Alexander I and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. Napoleon was outnumbered, about 73,000 French against 85,000 allies, but he devised one of the most brilliant tactical plans in military history. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, luring the Allies to attack what they thought was a vulnerable position. When they did, Napoleon struck at their weakened centre with devastating force, splitting their army in two. The Allies were routed. Austria sued for peace, ceding vast territories. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient ghostly institution that had lasted 1,000 years, was dissolved. Napoleon was the master of Central Europe. Prussia, which had remained neutral, watched Napoleon's growing power with alarm. In 1806, Prussia demanded that French forces withdraw from German territories. Napoleon's response was swift and brutal. In October 1806, at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, the vaunted Prussian army, the inheritors of Frederick the Great's military tradition, was smashed. Napoleon occupied Berlin. Prussia was reduced to a French satellite. Only Russia remained. In February 1807, Napoleon fought the Russians to a bloody stalemate at Eylau in a blizzard, one of his most costly battles. But in June 1807, at Friedland, Napoleon achieved a decisive victory over the Russian army. Tsar Alexander sued for peace. The two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit in July 1807. There, Napoleon and Alexander carved up Europe between them. Prussia was humiliated and reduced in size. A new French ally, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, was created from Prussian territory. Napoleon's empire stretched from Spain to Poland. He was the most powerful man in Europe since Charlemagne. These were Napoleon's glory days. He was 40 years old, at the height of his powers. His Grande Armée was considered invincible. His marshals were legends. His empire seemed unshakable. But the seeds of destruction were already being sown. Napoleon's empire faced two fundamental problems: Britain and the legacy of revolution. Britain remained undefeated, protected by its navy and financing coalition after coalition against France. Napoleon's response was the Continental System, a blockade intended to destroy British trade by prohibiting European nations from trading with Britain. It was economic warfare on a grand scale, but it was also unenforceable and deeply unpopular. Portugal refused to join the Continental System, remaining Britain's ally. Napoleon decided to invade. In 1807, French armies crossed Spain with Spanish permission to attack Portugal. But Napoleon had larger plans. He saw Spain's weak monarchy as an opportunity. In 1808, through deception and pressure, Napoleon forced the Spanish king to abdicate and placed his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Spanish people rose in rebellion against the French occupation. On May 2nd, year 1808, Madrid erupted in violence against French troops. Napoleon's response was brutal repression, captured forever in Goya's haunting paintings the 2nd of May and the 3rd of May. But repression only fueled resistance. The Peninsular War, as it became known, was unlike anything Napoleon had faced. This was not battles between armies, but a bitter guerrilla war. Spanish irregular forces, aided by British troops under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, attacked French supply lines, ambushed patrols, and melted back into the population. The Spanish word guerrilla entered military vocabulary. French atrocities fueled more resistance. Spanish atrocities against French soldiers matched them. Napoleon called Spain his ulcer, and it bled his empire white. Year after year, hundreds of thousands of French troops were tied down in Spain, unable to be deployed elsewhere. The war cost France over 300,000 casualties. More devastating, it shattered the myth of French invincibility and encouraged resistance elsewhere. Meanwhile, Austria saw an opportunity. In 1809, Austria attacked again, hoping to liberate German territories while Napoleon was distracted in Spain. Napoleon rushed back to Germany and won victories at Abensberg and Eckmühl. But at Aspern-Essling in May 1809, Napoleon suffered his first major personal defeat on the battlefield. The Austrian Archduke Charles had proven that Napoleon could be beaten. Napoleon rebounded with a massive victory at Wagram in July 1809, forcing Austria to make peace again. But the battles had been costly, the victories not as complete as before. Austria lost territory but remained intact and bitter. The tide was beginning to turn. Napoleon's personal life was also in crisis. Despite a passionate marriage, Josephine had not given him an heir. Napoleon was obsessed with founding a dynasty, and that required a son. In December 1809, with visible pain on both sides, Napoleon divorced Josephine. She retired to Château de Malmaison, where she would die 5 years later. Napoleon needed a royal bride to legitimize his new empire. He considered a Russian Grand Duchess, but the Tsar's family dragged their feet. Instead, Napoleon turned to the oldest dynasty in Europe, the Habsburgs. In March 1810, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I and grandniece of Marie Antoinette. The Corsican upstart had married into the family that had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. In March 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, whom Napoleon immediately named King of Rome. The succession was secured. Napoleon had everything he had dreamed of: an empire, a dynasty, a legitimate heir. But his empire was built on conquest, sustained by force, and dependent on his personal genius. It was already beginning to crumble. The alliance with Russia had always been fragile. Tsar Alexander resented being forced into the continental system, which hurt Russian trade. French and Russian interests clashed in Poland, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. By year 1811, both sides were preparing for war. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée of 1812 numbered over 600,000 men, drawn from France and every nation under Napoleon's control or alliance. It included French, Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Austrians, and others. It was a truly European army, and it marched east in June 1812. Napoleon's plan was to defeat the Russian army in a decisive battle near the frontier, force Alexander to make peace and return home by autumn, but the Russians refused to give him his battle. They retreated, drawing Napoleon deeper into Russia, burning crops and supplies as they went. Napoleon followed, reaching Vilnius, then Vitebsk, then Smolensk, always expecting the decisive battle that never came. The advance became a nightmare. The roads were terrible. Supplies failed to keep pace. Heat and dust tormented the troops. Horses died by the thousands. Desertion and disease ravaged the army. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, he had already lost 100,000 men without fighting a major battle. Finally, at Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow, on September 7th, year 1812, the Russians under General Kutuzov made a stand. The result was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. In a battle of grinding attrition, with little tactical finesse, over 70,000 men were killed or wounded. Napoleon won the field, but at a terrible cost. The Russian army retreated, but remained intact. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting the Tsar to sue for peace. Instead, he found the city largely abandoned. That night, fires broke out across Moscow, set by the Russians themselves. For 3 days, Moscow burned. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin for 5 weeks, sending letters to Alexander that went unanswered. Winter was approaching. His army was deep in Russia, with supply lines stretched to breaking. The Tsar would not negotiate. On October 19th, Napoleon began the retreat. It became one of history's greatest military disasters. Early snowstorms turned the roads to mud, then ice. The temperature plunged. Hungry, freezing soldiers straggled along in disorganized columns. Russian cavalry and Cossacks harassed them constantly. At the Berezina River crossing in late November, the army nearly disintegrated entirely, though Napoleon's engineers managed to save part of the force. Napoleon himself left the army in December, racing back to Paris in a sleigh to contain the political damage. He left behind a shattered wreck of an army. Of the 600,000 men who had invaded Russia, perhaps 100,000 returned. Most were killed, captured, or died of disease and exposure. The Grande Armée was destroyed. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility was shattered beyond repair. All of Europe sensed Napoleon's weakness. In early 1813, Prussia switched sides and joined Russia. Austria, despite the family connection through Marie-Louise, began to waver. Sweden, now led by Napoleon's former Marshal Bernadotte, who had become heir to the Swedish throne, joined the Allies. Only the German states of the Confederation of the Rhine remained reluctant allies. Napoleon showed astonishing resilience. He raised a new army from teenagers and veterans. In the spring of the year 1813, he won battles at Lutzen and Bautzen, demonstrating that his tactical brilliance remained. But he lacked cavalry to pursue defeated enemies, and his new conscripts lacked the training of his veterans. The victories were incomplete. An armistice in the summer of year 1813 gave the Allies time to coordinate. Austria joined the coalition. Napoleon now faced Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, along with Britain and Spain, where Wellington was pushing into southern France. The Allies adopted the Trachenberg Plan, avoiding direct confrontation with Napoleon while attacking his marshals. It was effective. At Leipzig, in October 1813, the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars erupted. For 3 days, Napoleon fought the combined Allied armies, totaling over 300,000 men. On the third day, Saxon troops in Napoleon's army defected to the Allies during the battle. The French were forced to retreat. In the chaos of the withdrawal, the bridge over the Elster River was blown prematurely, trapping thousands of French soldiers who were killed or captured. Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, was a catastrophic defeat. Napoleon retreated across the Rhine into France. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved. Germany was lost. Only Italy and France itself remained. In January 1814, the Allies invaded France from the east, while Wellington invaded from the south. Napoleon conducted a brilliant defensive campaign in early 1814, winning several small victories against separated Allied columns in what became known as the 6 Days Campaign. It was Napoleon's last display of military genius, often compared to his first Italian campaign. But he was vastly outnumbered and could not be everywhere at once. Napoleon's marshals and generals began to lose faith. They were tired of war, wealthy from their conquests, and wanted peace. Napoleon's subordinates started to think of their own futures. On March 31st, year 1814, Paris capitulated to the Allies. Napoleon wanted to march on the capital, but his marshals refused. At Fontainebleau, his generals, led by Marshal Ney, confronted him. The army would no longer follow. It was over. On April 6th, Napoleon abdicated. He attempted suicide by taking poison he had carried since the Russian campaign, but the poison had lost its potency and he survived, vomiting in agony through the night. The Allies exiled him to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy. They gave him sovereignty over the island, a personal guard of 1,000 men, and an annual allowance from the French government. Marie-Louise and his son were sent to Vienna. He would never see them again. The Bourbons were restored to the French throne in the person of Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI. Napoleon sailed to Elba, arriving on May 4th. He was 44 years old. His empire was gone, his family scattered, his enemies triumphant. But his story was not finished. Napoleon did not adapt well to exile. He threw himself into governing his tiny island kingdom, building roads, reorganizing the iron mines, creating a miniature state. But he watched events in France closely. The restored Bourbon monarchy was deeply unpopular. Louis XVIII had learned nothing and forgotten nothing, surrounding himself with émigrés who wanted to turn back the clock. The army, in particular, loathed the Bourbons and remained loyal to Napoleon. The Congress of Vienna, where the victorious Allies were redrawing the map of Europe, was deadlocked over Poland and Saxony, with Russia and Austria nearly coming to blows. The coalition was fracturing. The French government stopped paying Napoleon's allowance. Rumours swirled that he would be moved to a more remote prison, perhaps in the Atlantic. Napoleon decided to act. On February 26th, year 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with about 1,000 soldiers on a small flotilla of ships. He landed in southern France on March 1st. It was an insane gamble. He had only his charisma and his legend. If the French army arrested him, he would be imprisoned or executed. But Napoleon had read the situation correctly. As he marched north toward Paris, royal troops were sent to stop him. At La Fraye, near Grenoble, Napoleon encountered the 1st Regiment. He walked toward them alone and called out, "Soldiers of the 5th, you recognize me. If any man would shoot his emperor, he may do so now." The soldiers broke ranks and rushed to embrace him, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Regiment after regiment defected. Marshal Ney, sent to arrest Napoleon, promised to bring him back in an iron cage, but joined him instead. On March 20th, Napoleon entered Paris without firing a shot. Louis XVIII had fled. Napoleon was back in power. It had taken him just 20 days. The flight of the eagle became legend. But the European powers were having none of it. Within days of Napoleon's return, the Allies declared him an outlaw and mobilized their armies. Napoleon faced the 7th Coalition: Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and their allies. Napoleon tried diplomacy, offering to accept restrictions on French power, but the Allies would accept nothing less than his abdication. He had perhaps 200,000 troops immediately available, but the Allies would soon have over 700,000 converging on France. Napoleon's only hope was to strike first, defeat the British and Prussian armies in Belgium before the Austrians and Russians arrived, and hope that political pressure would force the Allies to negotiate. On June 15th, year 1815, Napoleon crossed into Belgium with 128,000 men. His plan was to drive between the British army under Wellington and the Prussian army under Blücher, defeat them separately, then march on Brussels. It was a classic Napoleonic maneuver. On June 16th, Napoleon attacked the Prussians at Ligny, while Marshal Ney engaged the British at Quatre Bras. Napoleon defeated Blücher, though not decisively, and the Prussians retreated, but Ney failed to pin down the British. Wellington retreated in good order to a position he had scouted near the village of Waterloo. June 17th was lost to heavy rain and mud. Napoleon delayed his attack on June 18th to allow the ground to dry for his artillery. This delay would prove fatal. At 11:30 a.m., the Battle of Waterloo began. Wellington had chosen his position brilliantly, on a ridge with a reverse slope that protected his infantry from Napoleon's artillery. Napoleon's attacks throughout the day were fierce but piecemeal. The British line bent but did not break. Wellington kept repeating, "Night or the Prussians must come." Late in the afternoon, Prussian advance units began arriving on Napoleon's right flank. Blücher had not retreated eastward as Napoleon assumed, but had circled back to aid Wellington. Napoleon committed his Imperial Guard in a desperate final attack. These veterans had never been defeated. But Wellington's infantry formed squares and poured devastating volleys into the advancing columns. For the first time in history, the Imperial Guard broke and retreated. Wellington raised his hat, signalling a general advance. The French army disintegrated into a rout. Napoleon fled the field and returned to Paris. He tried to rally support, but his political base had evaporated. On June 22nd, he abdicated for the second time. He considered escaping to America, but the Royal Navy blockaded the French coast. On July 15th, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, hoping for exile in England. The British had other plans. The British government decided that Napoleon was too dangerous to be left anywhere he might escape. They chose St. Helena, a tiny volcanic island in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest land. It was one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. There would be no escape from St. Helena. Napoleon arrived at St. Helena in October 1815. He was installed at Longwood House, a damp, rat-infested building that would be his prison for the rest of his life. He was 46 years old, overweight, and already showing signs of declining health. The conditions at Longwood were deliberately harsh. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, was a petty bureaucrat who saw Napoleon as merely a prisoner, not a fallen emperor. Lowe imposed humiliating restrictions. Napoleon was forbidden to leave the immediate grounds without a British officer escort. His mail was read. Visitors were restricted. Lowe insisted on calling him General Bonaparte, refusing to acknowledge his imperial title. Napoleon responded with contempt, refusing to see Lowe whenever possible. Napoleon's household consisted of a small group of loyal followers who had volunteered to accompany him into exile. General Bertrand and his wife, Count de Montholon and his wife, General Gourgaud, and his valet Marchand. Emmanuel de las Cases, a former chamberlain, also came and would record Napoleon's conversations, creating the essential memorial of St. Helena. Life at St. Helena settled into a grim routine. Napoleon rose late, dictated his memoirs and correspondence, took brief walks in the garden, played cards or chess in the evening, and went to bed. The isolation and confinement were psychologically crushing for a man who had commanded armies and governed an empire. Small squabbles and jealousies erupted among his tiny court. The Montholons and Bertrands feuded. Gourgaud was jealous and temperamental. But Napoleon used his exile productively. He dictated thousands of pages of memoirs, justifying his actions, reinterpreting his defeats as victories, and shaping his own legend for posterity. He portrayed himself as a son of the revolution who had brought order and progress to Europe, a champion of nationalism who had awakened the peoples of Europe, a lawgiver whose codes had modernized society. Much of this was self-serving mythology, but it was brilliantly effective. The Napoleon of St. Helena created the Napoleonic legend that would inspire revolutionaries and nationalists throughout the 19th century. The political climate in Europe was shifting in Napoleon's favour, ironically. The restored monarchies were reactionary and repressive. The Congress of Vienna had redrawn borders without regard for nationalist sentiment. Revolutionary movements were stirring. Liberals and nationalists increasingly looked back on Napoleon's rule with nostalgia. The man who had crowned himself emperor was being reimagined as a champion of liberty. The British government's harsh treatment of Napoleon made him a sympathetic figure, a martyr to British vindictiveness. But Napoleon's health was deteriorating. By year 1817, he was complaining of pain in his right side. He became increasingly lethargic, spending entire days in bed. He gained weight, then began losing it rapidly. His legs swelled. He vomited frequently. The British doctors diagnosed hepatitis, possibly complicated by amoebic dysentery from the tropical climate. Modern historians have debated whether he was also suffering from stomach cancer, the disease that killed his father, or whether he was being slowly poisoned by arsenic in the wallpaper at Longwood House, though the poisoning theory is generally discounted by serious scholars. By early year 1821, Napoleon was clearly dying. He wrote his will, leaving careful instructions and distributing his remaining possessions among his followers. He dictated final messages to his son, whom he had not seen since 1814. His son, now living in Vienna as the Duke of Reichstadt under Austrian guardianship, would never be allowed to inherit his father's legacy. On May 5th, year 1821, at 5:49 inches the afternoon, Napoleon Bonaparte died at age 51. His last words were unclear, possibly France, army, head of the army. Josephine. Even in death, he returned to what had defined his life: France, military glory, and his first great love. The British conducted an autopsy. The official cause of death was listed as stomach cancer, though the findings were disputed. Napoleon had requested to be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the French people I have loved so much, but the British refused. He was buried on St. Helena, in a peaceful valley called the Valley of the Geraniums, under a simple stone with no name. The British and French could not agree on what inscription to use. The story did not end with Napoleon's death. In many ways, it was just beginning. The Napoleonic legend, carefully crafted by Napoleon himself during his exile, took on a life of its own. Within years of his death, Napoleon was being celebrated in popular culture throughout Europe. Songs, plays, poems, and novels romanticized his life. Victor Hugo, Stendhal, Byron, Beethoven, the great romantic artists of the age, were all influenced by Napoleon's legend. In 1840, 19 years after his death, the French government under King Louis Philippe requested that Britain return Napoleon's remains. The British agreed. Napoleon's body was exhumed from St. Helena and brought back to France on the frigate Belle Poule. On December 15th, year 1840, in a magnificent ceremony attended by hundreds of thousands of Parisians, Napoleon's remains were interred at Les Invalides in Paris, where they remain today in a massive red porphyry tomb. He had finally returned to the banks of the Seine. Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, used the Napoleonic legend to gain power, becoming President of France in 1848 and then Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. The Second Empire explicitly invoked the glory of the First. The Napoleonic legend had become a political force in itself. But what was Napoleon's actual legacy, beyond the mythology? It was profound and contradictory, progressive and destructive, liberating and tyrannical. The Napoleonic Code was perhaps his most enduring achievement. It established equality before the law, protected property rights, abolished feudalism, and secularized the state. It made divorce legal, established the rights of illegitimate children, and codified civil liberties. The code was adopted throughout much of Europe and Latin America and influenced legal systems worldwide. Even today, the civil law tradition based on the Napoleonic Code is one of the world's major legal systems alongside the common law tradition. Napoleon's administrative reforms modernized the French state and served as models for other nations. The centralized bureaucracy, the prefect system for local administration, the reformed educational system with its lycées and grandes écoles, the Bank of France, the Legion of Honor. These institutions survived Napoleon, and many still exist today. Napoleon's meritocratic principles, where advancement was based on talent rather than birth, were revolutionary. His marshals came from all backgrounds. Murat was an innkeeper's son, Ney a cooper's son. Lannes, a dyer's son. This opening of careers to talent helped create modern professional armies and civil services based on merit. Napoleon's impact on nationalism was paradoxical. He spread revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and national sovereignty throughout Europe, but he did so as a conqueror, imposing French domination. The experience of French occupation awakened national consciousness in Germany, Italy, Spain, and elsewhere. The people Napoleon conquered learned nationalism, partly from French revolutionary ideals and partly from resisting French imperialism. The 19th century movements for Italian and German unification can be traced directly to the Napoleonic era. Militarily, Napoleon revolutionized warfare. His emphasis on mobility, concentration of force, living off the land, and destroying enemy armies rather than besieging fortresses became the basis for modern warfare. His organizational innovations, the corps system, the use of artillery, the integration of different arms, were studied by military leaders for generations. The Prussian military theorist Clausewitz developed his ideas while fighting against Napoleon. Every major military academy in the world studies Napoleon's campaigns, but the cost of Napoleon's ambitions was staggering. The Napoleonic Wars killed an estimated 3 to 6 million people, including perhaps 1 million French. Entire regions were devastated. The Peninsular War brutalized Spain. The Russian campaign decimated populations. The constant warfare bankrupted treasuries, destroyed trade, and caused famines. Napoleon's political legacy is equally ambiguous. He came to power promising to preserve the revolution, but he created a dictatorship and then a hereditary empire. He gave France order and stability, but at the cost of political freedom. His censorship was severe. He controlled the press, banned opposition, and ruled as an authoritarian. Yet he maintained revolutionary legal and social reforms. He was, in many ways, an enlightened despot in the 18th century tradition, but dressed in revolutionary rhetoric. Napoleon himself understood his contradictory legacy. At St. Helena, he famously said, "I closed the gulf of anarchy and cleared the chaos. I purified the revolution, dignified nations, and established kings. I excited every kind of emulation, rewarded every kind of merit, and extended the limits of glory. This is at least something. And on what point can I be assailed on which an historian could not defend me?" Yet he also admitted, "I desired the empire of the world, and to secure it unlimited power was necessary to me." This is the essential Napoleon, a man of staggering genius and ambition, who brought both progress and destruction, who liberated and enslaved, who built and destroyed. He was the child of the Enlightenment and the Revolution, a military genius, an administrative reformer, a ruthless tyrant, and a romantic hero. He contained all these contradictions within himself. Napoleon's impact on specific nations varied greatly. France received modern institutions and a powerful national myth, but paid in blood and treasure. Germany was fragmented, occupied, but also modernized and awakened to national consciousness. Italy was similarly both oppressed and modernized, planted with the seeds of eventual unification. Spain suffered terribly, but developed a fierce national identity through resistance. Russia's victory over Napoleon gave it confidence and power that would last until the Crimean War. Britain, Napoleon's most consistent enemy, emerged from the wars as the world's dominant power. The Royal Navy's supremacy was unchallenged. British industry, stimulated by war production and protected from continental competition by the continental system, surged ahead. The balance of power in Europe that Britain desired was achieved, but at enormous cost in blood and gold. The smaller nations that Napoleon created, the Kingdom of Italy, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, the Kingdom of Westphalia, were swept away after his fall. But the administrative and legal reforms he introduced in these territories often survived. Even nations that fought against Napoleon sometimes adopted his reforms after his defeat, recognizing their value. Napoleon's cultural impact was immense. He appears in more works of art, literature, film, and television than perhaps any historical figure except Jesus Christ. He has been portrayed as a hero, a villain, a genius, a tyrant, a romantic figure, and a tragic hero. His life story has the arc of classical tragedy. The hero's rise from nothing to supreme power, his fatal flaw of ambition, and his inevitable fall. The 19th century was obsessed with Napoleon. Historians wrote massive, multi-volume studies of his campaigns. Artists painted him crossing the Alps, in exile at St. Helena, dying on his deathbed. Writers like Tolstoy in War and Peace grappled with the meaning of his life and whether great men shape history or are shaped by forces beyond their control. The question, was Napoleon great or terrible, became a central debate in 19th century thought. In the 20th century, new perspectives emerged. Some historians saw Napoleon as a proto-fascist, a dictator whose ambitions presaged Hitler and Mussolini. Others saw him as a modernizer who accelerated Europe's transformation into the modern world. Feminist historians noted his reactionary views on women, whom he saw as subordinate to men. Post-colonial historians examined his reinstitution of slavery in French colonies, a terrible stain on his record. The French relationship with Napoleon remains complicated. He is celebrated as a military genius and reformer, but his wars devastated France. The Arc de Triomphe and the Place Vendôme commemorate his victories, but they also commemorate defeat and occupation. In modern France, Napoleon is taught as both a great national figure and a warning about the dangers of authoritarian rule. Globally, Napoleon's influence is visible everywhere. The metric system, which he promoted though did not invent, became the global standard. The continental legal tradition he codified is used in most of the world. The concept of nationalism that he both spread and provoked shapes modern politics. The professional military based on merit that he exemplified became the model worldwide. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Napoleon is how much he accomplished in such a short time. From his first command in 1796 to his final defeat in 1815, his active career lasted just 19 years. In that time, he rose from obscurity to become the most powerful man in Europe, crowned himself emperor, codified laws that still govern billions of people, fought over 60 battles, created and destroyed nations, and left a mark on history that remains visible over 2 centuries later. Napoleon Bonaparte was many things: a military genius, an administrative innovator, an enlightened despot, a ruthless tyrant, a champion of merit, a destroyer of liberty, a spreader of revolution, a builder of empire. He was all of these, and the contradictions are not reconcilable because they were all true. He was a man of extraordinary talents and extraordinary flaws, who rose to heights few humans ever reach and fell just as dramatically. In the end, perhaps the best summary of Napoleon comes from his own words. When asked on St. Helena what he wished written on his tomb, he said simply, "Napoleon. No title, no achievements, no justification, just the name." Because the name itself had become enough. It had become legendary. For those interested in what became of Napoleon's family and associates after his death, the stories are fascinating. Napoleon's son, Napoleon II, the King of Rome, lived his entire life as a virtual prisoner in Vienna, controlled by his Austrian grandfather. He died of tuberculosis in 1832 at age 21, never having ruled France. His death ended Napoleon's direct male line. Josephine had died in 1814, before Napoleon's final return, reportedly catching a chill while walking with Tsar Alexander I, who occupied Paris at the time. She never remarried after her divorce from Napoleon. Marie-Louise married twice more after Napoleon's death and lived until the year 1847. She never attempted to help her son claim his French inheritance and seemed content to forget her brief time as empress. Napoleon's mother, Letizia, outlived her famous son, dying in 1836 at age 86 in Rome. She remained loyal to Napoleon's memory and never accepted the Bourbon Restoration. Of Napoleon's siblings, all had been made kings or princes during the empire. Joseph, briefly King of Spain, lived in exile in America for years before returning to Europe. He died in Florence in 1844. Lucien, who had helped Napoleon during the Brumaire coup, spent his later years in Italy and died in 1840. Louis, who had been King of Holland, died in 1846. Jerome, the youngest brother and King of Westphalia, lived until the year 1860 and even briefly returned to prominence during the Second Empire. The sisters Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline all died in the 1820s and 1830s. Many of Napoleon's marshals served the restored Bourbons, though some, like Ney, were executed for treason after the 100 Days. Others lived long lives, wealthy from their conquests, but never again experiencing the glory of the empire. Davout died in 1823, Soult in 1851, Suchet in 1826. Murat, who had become King of Naples, tried to reclaim his throne in 1815 and was executed. Bernadotte, who became King of Sweden, founded a dynasty that still rules Sweden today. Wellington, Napoleon's final conqueror, had a long career in British politics and died in 1852, one of the most celebrated Britons of the 19th century. Blücher died in 1819. Tsar Alexander I died in 1825 under mysterious circumstances. The memory of Napoleon lived on most powerfully in his nephew, Louis Napoleon, who became Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, establishing the Second French Empire. His reign lasted until the year 1870, when he was defeated by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War. The Napoleonic dynasty ended with him, though Bonaparte descendants still exist today. The Napoleonic legend inspired revolutionaries throughout the 19th century. Simon Bolivar, who liberated much of South America, admired Napoleon. Giuseppe Garibaldi, who unified Italy, invoked Napoleon's memory. Even as late as the 20th century, leaders claimed to be heirs to the Napoleonic tradition. Today, Napoleon's tomb in Les Invalides receives millions of visitors. His palaces at Versailles, Fontainebleau, and Malmaison are museums. The battlefield of Waterloo is preserved as a memorial. St. Helena maintains Longwood House as a historical site. The Code Napoleon remains in force, in modified form, in France and many other countries. 200 years after his death, Napoleon Bonaparte remains vividly alive in human memory and imagination. His story continues to fascinate, inspire, and warn. He was, in the end, the man who proved that an individual can indeed change history, for better and for worse. This concludes the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of history's most remarkable figures